tutorial is going to cover conditionals and class constants. Before we begin, make sure that you have Java and the Java JDK downloaded on your computer. You can run java-version in your terminal to check. And make sure that you have IntelliJ downloaded on your computer. It's suggested that you watch the previous Java tutorials that are in this same playlist. So we're going to start with if statements. What is an if statement? An if statement is a chunk of code that executes a block of statements only if a given test, which will be a Boolean logical statement, evaluates to true. So this is what the code looks like for that. It's if, and then test in parentheses, and then an opening brace and a closing brace, and statement A, and then statement B will be outside of that. And this is what that structure evaluates to. So it'll test to see if it's true. If the answer is yes, it'll execute statement A, and then statement B. And if the answer is no, it'll go straight to statement B, skipping over statement A. And just a note again on scope. Remember, variables only last as far as their braces. So if you create a variable inside of this if statement, it will only be able to be recognized within the context of that if statement. So just keep that in mind as you're writing programs. So we're going to do an if example, and it's going to be a method that defaults answer to no and sets answer to yes if a given whole number is greater than 30, and then returns the answer. So I'm going to right click and do new package. I'm going to call this package Conditionals and Class Constants. And then I'm going to do new Java class conditional examples. Okay, double click to make the left pane go away. And as always, I'm going to add in the main method. Okay, so I need a method that takes in a whole number and returns a string, because from this I can tell that answer is going to be a string. So it's going to be public static string is over 30. And I didn't do is over 30 because is normally means that a method actually returns a Boolean, so I'm just going to keep it as over 30. And I need to look at a whole number, so it's going to be int num. And I'm going to start out with string answer being equal to no. And I'm getting an error here because it's missing a return statement. So at the bottom, I'm going to go ahead and return answer. And it wants me to set answer equal to yes if the given whole number is greater than 30. So I'm going to do if num is greater than 30, answer is equal to yes. And that's all I need to do. So now I'm going to call over 30 twice in my main method just to show that it works. So I'm going to do system.out.println is 34 over 30 plus over 30 for 34. And then I'm going to do the same thing for 24. And I'm going to go ahead and print out a new line so that the next time I do a method that there's a new line between all the different sets of method calls. So I'm going to do run, and choose conditional examples. It's going to run for me. And now I say, it says yes for 34 and no for 24, just like I expected. Okay, so now we're going to talk about if-else. An if-else statement is a chunk of code that executes one block if the test is true and another if it's false. So the code for that looks like this. If test, execute statement A, else execute statement B, and then after both of these, always execute statement C. So this is what the structure of that looks like. So is the test true? If yes, do statement A and then statement C. If it's not true, execute statement B, then execute statement C. So try to keep this structure in mind as you're building up these if-else statements. So we're going to do an if-else example. A method that prints would round up if a given non-whole number would round up, and prints would round down otherwise. And remember, we did a similar round up, round down, Boolean check in the previous tutorial. Or was it? It was either in the previous tutorial or one of the previous practice problems. But in any case, we've seen this pattern before, right? So we should know how to solve this. So first thing is this method is just going to print, so it's not going to return anything. So this method is going to be void. So public static void. And then I'm going to call it would round up. Actually, I'm going to call this prints if would prints rounding direction. And it wants to take in a non-whole number, so that's a double. Okay, so I want just the decimal part, so I'm going to create double decimal part equals num mod 1, right? Because modding by 1 will give me the remainder after I've divided by 1, and that'll give me just the decimal part of the number. So I'm going to say if num is greater than or equal to 0.5, and actually I want if decimal part is greater than or equal to 0.5, then I want to print out would round down. Or else system.out.println would round up. Actually, I have these backwards. Oops. If it's greater than or equal to 0.5, it would round up, and if it's less than 0.5, it would round down. Okay, so I have that in place now, and I want to call it twice, once when it would round up and once when it would round down. Oops. So I want to do system.out.print, and I'm going to say that 2.75, and then I'm going to call print would round down with 2.75, and I got an error because I should have been doing this. Okay, now I use print here instead of println because I want this to be on the same line as the would round down. So the next time, I'm going to do system.out.print system 1.2, then I'm going to call prints round direction with 1.2 to see what would happen in that case. And again, I want to put an empty line at the end for the next set of examples that I'm going to do. So now I want to hit the green triangle. Okay, and it gave me what I expected. 2.75 would round up, and 1.2 would round down. So that's that example done. Okay, so a cool trick is a tertiary if statement. A tertiary if statement is a way to set a value as if you're using an if-else statement, but it only takes up one line. So here's an example. I have int x equals to 4, and I say int y equals x greater than 3, question mark, 2, colon, 14. And what this means is that if x is greater than 3, set y to be 2, otherwise set it to be 14. So in this case, y would end up being 2 because x is greater than 3. So really what this is saying is if x is greater than 3, set y equal to 2. Else, set y equal to 14. And that's it. These can be very helpful in the simple situations where you're just setting one variable based on another variable or a set of circumstances. So there's also nested if-else statements, which is a chunk of code that chooses between outcomes using many different tests. And this is an example of just a two-test version, but you can have as many tests in a row as you want with a nested if-else. So first we have if test 1, do statement A, else if test 2, do statement B, else statement C, and then always do statement D after this if-else chunk. And this is the structure. So if test 1 is true, do statement A. If test 1 is false, check test 2, that's hard to say. And if yes, do statement B, and then statement D. And if both test 1 and test 2 are false, do statement C, and then do statement D. So we're going to do a nested if-else example. So it's going to be a method that takes in a whole number grade and returns the letter grade as a single character that goes with it. A negative grade will result in an I for incomplete. So an example would be, if we got an 87, it would return a B. So we know we want to return a single character, so we're going to return a char. So public static char C number to letter grade. And it wants to take in a whole number, so it's going to take in int grade. And again, I get this error that's missing a return statement. So I'm going to do return I. And that's just a placeholder return statement. We'll see what happens as I go through this whole thing, but you don't always have to have a return at the very end. If there is an execution path that leads to a return for every possible value of grade, then you won't get that error anymore. And you'll see what I mean after I get done with building up this function. Okay, so the first thing to check is if it's negative. So if grade is less than 0, return I. Else if and I get an error here because it's expecting another test. So I'm going to do grade is greater than 0 and grade is less than. So this is the F range, right? So Fs are anything that are less than a 60, right? 60 to 70 is D, 70 to 80 is C, 80 to 90 is a B, and 90 to 100 is an A. So less than a 60, return F. Else if grade is greater than or equal to 60, and grade is less than 70. Return D. Okay, now see a problem between these two, if and else if? I didn't include 0. So if somebody gets exactly a 0, neither of these cases take care of it. So I'm just going to go ahead and put an equal there, because F can be 0. So this is telling me, it's just a warning saying that the condition grade is greater than 60 will always be true at this point in the execution. So I don't actually need this first part. right? Because of the way that I'm doing my if-else. So I checked first if it was less than 0, and then if it's not less than 0, then it has to be less than 60. It has to be at least as big as 0, which means it'll always be, which means that it is encompassed in this statement. I'm doing this poorly. If this is false, it has to be at least 0, which means I don't need to check if it's at least 0. So I can do just this. And if this is false, it means it's at least 60, so I can just do this check. I don't need to check if it's greater than 60. So then else if grade is less than 80, return C. Else if grade is less than 90, return B. Else return A. And this is anything 90 plus is an A. And now I get this error of an unreachable statement. And that means that every execution path above this leads to a return, so there's no way to get here without returning yet. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this line. And now I have this nice if-else block for all of this. Now, because I'm returning inside of each of these else-ifs, I could have just done a series of ifs because the return would take care of stopping the execution before I got to the other returns. But for the sake of this example, I'm just going to do the else-ifs, which are nice. Okay. So now I want to call number to letter grade up here once for all these different letter grades so I can make sure that it's working. So I'm going to say -12 is a number to letter grade -12. So I want that for an I, I want F, D, C, B, A. So I want to do 12, it's an F, 62, 72, that's a C, 82, 92. Go ahead and play. And it's just like we expected to see. I, F, D, C, B, A. All the way down for all those values. Now, if we were going to be doing more tests, we probably would want to do more than just, these 10 apart. We would want to do ones on the border, so like a 60 and a 70, one that's more negative, one that's at exactly 0. But for our purposes, this is enough to convince me that what we wrote works. So slide this over again. So class constants. A class constant is a variable that is declared at the top of your class that is used throughout the class to avoid magic values in your code. The constant's name gives more context to what's going on in the code. So for example, if you had a 4 that you knew was going to be used multiple times in your code, you wouldn't want to just put 4 everywhere, right? Because that doesn't make any sense. Nobody knows what that 4 means. And later, if you need to change that value from a 4 to like a 6, you'd have to go through and remember everywhere in your code where that value was. And if you have a class constant for it, you can just change that 4 to a 6 in one place and it's changed everywhere. The naming convention is all caps with underscores where spaces would be if the constant's name is more than one word. and that's just called snake case. So here's an example. We have this final private int example equals 4. And private just means that only the current class has access to it. And like I said, it's in all caps, and you can just use it in your code like any other variable. And this final means that it won't change throughout the running of the code. So practice for later, paper, rock, scissors. Write a method that takes in 2 players' moves and returns who is the winner of the game of rock, paper, scissors. So the return options are player 1 wins or player 2 wins with an explanation of why they won. In the case of a tie, return tie game. Ways to win. Rock beats paper, paper covers rock, scissors cuts paper. Use the constant, and you should be using constants for paper, rock, scissors, and they'll be string values. Call the method from the main with hard-coded values and print the results enough times to convince yourself that it works. So like, have player 1 win each type of way, and have player 2 win each type of way, and then have a couple of tie games. Switch statements. What is a switch statement? A switch statement is a chunk of code that chooses between outcomes using a simplified kind of mini-tests. It's like another form of a nested if-else. They should be used whenever you would do a nested if-else with a bunch of equality checks. So here's an example. You have switch variable, and then case 1, value 1, colon, statement A, and then break, case value 2. And so this is basically saying if variable equals value 1, do this. And then the break separates the different cases so that they are distinct from each other and they don't bleed together. And then default is like else. It's what happens if none of the other cases are caught. And then you have statement D outside of all of it, which happens regardless of what happens inside of the switch. So if you have missing breaks, if your switch statement doesn't have a break for each case, the case will fall through and multiple cases statements will be executed. This behavior is not normally what you would want to happen. There are times where you will want a fall through, but those are very few and far between. So the best practice is just always to put the break statements in before you start doing any other part of the code for your switch. Okay, so a switch statement example is a method that takes in a single letter grade and returns the grade range it covers as a string, and assume the grades can only be between 0 and 100. So an example would be an A would return 90 to 100. Okay. So I'm going to have public static, and it returns a string, so string. I'm going to do letter to number grade range. And it's going to take in a single letter, so char grade. Okay, so I don't want to put my return statements inside my switch because then you won't be able to see the breaks. So I'm going to go ahead and create string letter grade here at the top, and then return letter grade at the bottom. So I get this error that says letter grade might not be initialized. So I will do the initialization as part of my switch statement, but right now the computer thinks that letter grade might not actually get a value. And that's a worthwhile warning and error for me to get, because this will have problems later if I try to run the code with something that doesn't actually have a value. But I'll be giving it a value. So I have switch on grade, and I have case A. and it's going to return, and I'm going to say that letter grade is equal to 90 to 100. Break. Case B. Letter grade is equal to 80 to 89. Break. Case C. Letter grade is equal to 70 to 79. Break. Case D. Letter grade is equal to 60 to 69. Break. Case F. Letter grade is equal to 0 to 59. Break. And then I have a default case. So before I do default, notice that letter grade is still saying it might not be initialized. And that's because there still might not be a path through this switch statement where letter grade is given a value. But watch what happens when I do my default. Letter grade equals to not a valid grade. And now the error is gone because it's possible for letter grade to be given a value since default, which is similar to an else, so letter grade will always get a value based on this switch statement's contents. Okay, so now I want to call it from my main method just to convince myself that it works. So I'm going to call it with A through F and then E, because E is not a valid character. So system.out.println A range A, and then I want one for B, C, D, F, E, B, C, D, F, E, B, C, D, F, E. Press play. And see, it did exactly what I expected. A is 90 to 100, B is 80 to 89, C is 70 to 79, D is 60 to 69, F is 0 to 59, and E is not a valid grade. So let's see what happens if I remove all these break statements, just so that you can see what's going on. So I have all these saying it's assigned but never used. And that's just, that warning is just kind of there for now. It's not, what it's saying is that it gets reassigned before it's ever actually used again. And that warning would be indicative to you that you had maybe forgotten your break statements, but it's not like it's telling you exactly you forgot your break statements, make sure you put them in. But see, since I forgot my break statements, all of them became not a valid grade because it just skipped. It skipped from A to B to C to D to F all the way to default because the breaks never told it to, there were no breaks to tell it to stop. So I'm going to put them back in. I really do need those. And rerun it. And now it's what I expected again. Practice for later. Decoding a single hex digit. So for this practice, you're just going to write a method that takes in a single hex digit and returns the base 10 version of it. So remember, A is 10, B is 11, and so on. If a given number isn't part of the hex range, it should return a negative 1. And you should call this from the main to convince yourself that it works. And that's it. I hope that was helpful.